Chapter 4. Billy Creekmore. I predict someone's death, Rufus starts a club, and autumn brings a long, cold rain. We was both wrong, I told Rufus Twilly soon as he woke up. I nodded to the empty bed. It was Meek Jones. But he ain't 12, said Rufus, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He won't be till next year. I know. Mr. Beetle said he didn't know exactly how old he was. Told Mr. Colder a flood washed away his birth certificate. That's a lie, plain as day, said Rufus. Seems Mr. Colder pays him a fee for finding a good worker. For heaven's sake, said Rufus, how do you know? I went spying on them last night. Hid under the dining-room window and heard every word they said. I'd have asked you to come, but you was sound asleep. Well, wake me up next time, said Rufus. I like spying at night. I told him I would. The day progressed normal. Mr. Beetle weren't in the dining hall for breakfast or lunch, so we said our prayers sloppy and quick. Peggy slipped us extra biscuits and second ladles of soup. Geese nipped, cows kicked, and barn cats hissed. After lunch, Mrs. Beetle, all cranky and creased in her face, gave us our lessons in the cellar. She wrote the names of the presidents on the blackboard with her squeaky chalk and made us copy 'em down. She was an awful teacher, but, to be fair, I don't think a better one could have made a lesson stick. We was too worn out for that, 'cept for Rufus. He was focused as could be, taking care not to let his ink spill, and writing slow in his composition book. I let my mind wander, thinking about what lay beyond the mountains surrounding the orphanage, and generally enjoying the coolness of the room. Before we left, Mrs. Beetle called me over. She had a new postcard from my pa, the first one I had since Christmas. She dropped it in my hands, then scurried away, like she was too afraid to let her fingers touch mine, or look too long in my face. There was a picture of George Washington on the card, a drawing of a statue in a park surrounded by flowery trees. All the boys wanted to see it, for we hadn't ever seen but one other picture of him, the one Mrs. Beetle had hanging in our little classroom in the cellar. The words were written in blue ink. "With love from your pa," it said, as usual. I let the boys pass it around, feeling ever so mournful as I watched it go from hand to hand. Why my pa sent these cards I couldn't say. If he thought they'd lift my spirits, he was sorely wrong. On the hill above the chapel was a little graveyard where the boys that died of pneumonia and measles lay buried. I looked at the crosses, wishing I could do more than just sense spirits, wishing I could really talk to the dead. Maybe they could tell me why my pa didn't come get me, or if my mother forgave me for causing her death. Perhaps the spirits knew why he didn't just forget me entirely instead of sending me a card every now and then. It was shameful knowing that my pa was alive but didn't want to raise me. Back in the dormitory, I put the card in a little tin box I kept under my cot. Inside were a dozen others, and the only thing I had of my mother's, a broken string of beads. They were blue glass, frosted with gold and white. When I was younger, I used to think they looked like planets. Mr. Beetle was back by supper, leading us in our blessings and overseeing our table manners. He made Walter Barnes leave the table before he was done eating for slurping his soup, and boxed another boy on the ears for burping. He was revving up to give some boy a whipping, and all of us was getting pretty tense, especially Rufus, who tended to hiccup when he got scared. I could hear him stifle a few, so I pushed him under the table where there'd be less of a chance Mr. Beetle would hear. As we trudged back to the dormitory, I felt cold air from the river sinking into me. The day was ending fast, and autumn was on its way. Soon we'd be wearing our jackets all day, even sleeping in 'em, for we didn't have more than a thin blanket on our beds. Up ahead, some of the boys were throwing stones into the woods. A bird cried out. "Say, Billy," Willie Dawson called out, "what's that whippoorwill saying?" I had convinced the boys that my powers with the dead included understanding birds, since everyone knows they're the messengers between the living and the dead. I put a yearning look on my face and raised one hand to my chin. Boys stopped throwing stones and gathered round, waiting for me to talk. The sadness I felt ever since receiving my pa's card was disappearing, and I could feel a story coming on. It's saying someone we all know is going to die soon. I stared off into the distance like I was all consumed with translating what I heard, and it says, not to worry none, for it's going to be a merciful death that'll put an end to sufferin'. Maybe Mr. Beetle's going to die, Walter Barnes smirked. That'd put an end to my suffering. He took aim at the broken branch of a box elder and let a stone fly. It reached its mark with a sharp cracking sound. Walter was a good shot, and in general I stayed out of his way. "Is Mr. Beetle going to die, Billy?" asked Frank Vickers. "Where'd we all go if Mr. Beetle dies?" Even I was getting the cold shudders from standing in the near dark talking about death. "Whippoorwill don't want to say who's going to die," I said. "He only says not to worry none, 'cause like I said, it'll be a merciful death. He says everyone should turn round to the left 3 times, then spit on the ground to ward off any evil spirits lurking about." Even Walter Barnes, brash and hard-hearted as he was, turned and spat. No more birds cried out from the woods, and it was too dark to throw stones, so we turned in for the night. Weeks passed, and late summer became autumn. Leaves turned colors, then crinkled up and fell. Before it turned winter, a long, cold rain came. The paths got muddy and the river swelled. During the day we worked at shoveling mud out of the barn and laying down straw. Mrs. Beetle was having more and more of her spells, what with the wet weather and the short days, so there weren't no lessons to kill the time before lunch. One gray day when the rain stopped for a bit, Rufus came up with the idea of starting a club. He marched us into the woods and made us sit round a rock. "This here's the Robbers' Club," said Rufus to the circle of faces. "Everybody that wants to join has to take an oath and mix his blood on this here rock. All the members must swear to stick to the club and never tell our secrets to no one, and if anybody does something to anyone in the club, he must be banished and all members must swear revenge. Whoever hunts that person down has to bring back his scalp to this here rock. Then we'll have us an honor ceremony and cut a scar on his cheek and name him a warrior." Everybody was willing, so Rufus pulled out his pocket knife and squeezed the top of his middle finger plump and jabbed it till a drop of blood came out. He smeared his blood on the top of the rock and told us all to do the same. We passed the knife and mixed our blood, serious and quiet like we was in church. "Do we always have to kill the people?" asked Frank Vickers. "Oh, yes," said Rufus. "It's best to do so." "What's the business of this club?" asked Willis Dawson. "Robbin' and stealin' so we can meet ransom if one of us is to be kidnapped by pirates." At this Walter Barnes let out a snort of disgust and left, since he didn't have no tolerance for games about pirates. Killing and scalping didn't make no difference to him, but he couldn't stand anything like pirates or life in the olden days that came straight from books. Rufus went on talking about the clubhouse we were going to build off in the woods, and how each of us had to scavenge something in order to become a full member. It could be an animal pelt or a hawk's feather, an arrowhead, or something washed up on the river bank, but whatever it was, we had to find it on our own without help from anyone in the club. He said we had a week to find something to contribute, then we adjourned our meeting. For some reason, everyone but me was having luck finding things. Willis Dawson found a turtle shell, and Rufus found a dead falcon. He cut off the talons and fixed one set on a string to wear around his neck like an Indian, and donated the other to the club. I walked everywhere with my eyes to the ground looking for flint or a rock with a vein of crystal, but I weren't having no luck at all. Once when I was milking a cow, I thought I saw a blue butterfly wing, but when I cleared the straw it was just a piece of broken glass. Daylight weren't providing any good for me, so I promised myself I'd try searching in the next night with the full moon. Things turn up in the moonlight.